Here's a bishop to make excuses for God's behavior in the Old Testament.
Well, if you look in the writings of the new atheists, Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris, one of the classical arguments you'll find is, look, the God of the Bible is a dreadful God who's ordering all sorts of murder and mayhem and chaos. And to be fair, a lot of Christians wrestle with these passages as well, call them the hard passages, especially in the Old Testament. Think of the psalmist exulting in dashing babies' heads against the rock, the children of his enemies.
A common excuse that some apologists use for God ordering people to unalive children is that these kids are all going to heaven, so you're really doing them a favor. Even if that's true, why would a loving God order people to send these kids to heaven? Why couldn't God just make them all instantly and painlessly disappear? Why send people to do it in such horrific ways? That doesn't sound very loving.
Think of God telling Saul to put the ban on the Amalekites. That means kill every man, woman, child, and animal.
What did the children and animals do to deserve that?
Think of Joshua when he comes into the promised land, basically unleashes a blitzkrieg and then wipes out, puts to death entire populations. How about this passage we came across recently in the liturgy from the book of Exodus, in the story of Israel battling the Amalekites again, and Moses putting his arms up as long as he's praying, the battle goes well. And finally, Yahweh carries the day, and we hear this now. And Joshua mowed down Amalek and all his people with the edge of the sword. And it's followed immediately here in the lectionary by the word of the Lord. So I realize that even devout Christians can find this kind of passage difficult. Now, why? Well, it's because it seems so out of step with the God of the New Testament.
These passages certainly don't portray a God that is loving and merciful, as we are frequently told God is. Not only does God fail to show mercy to the guilty, he also refuses to show it to the innocent. Why do the children need to be attacked? What did the animals do to deserve this?
Jesus reveals the God of infinite mercy and compassion. Jesus says, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, pray for those who maltreat you, resist not evil. Jesus of the cross. I mean, how is that God reconcilable with this God of the Old Testament? Well, I'd say to both the new atheists and to Christians who wrestle with this is not a new problem, as though we've discovered this in the 21st century. This is an old issue in the life of the church. It goes back to some of the earliest days. There were people, think of the Gnostics, and especially of the Marcionites back in the 2nd century, who said, let's solve the problem simply by jettisoning the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a testament to a fallen or wicked God, not the true God. Get rid of that, and it's the New Testament that reveals the true God.
Some apologists today will still say, if you bring up what God is portrayed as doing in the Old Testament, that God was a bad guy back then, but he's a kinder, gentler God now that he's taken out his frustrations on Jesus, or that Jesus was the last required sacrifice or some such thing.
In the 5th chapter of the book of Revelation, we have that great scene. The visionaries up in the heavenly space, and a scroll comes out. So in those days, there weren't books like we have like this, but a scroll. So this great scroll, and it's sealed by 7 seals. The scroll stands for, if you want, the whole of the Bible. It's the whole of God's revelation. The sealing means it's hard to read. It's hard to interpret. Who will unlock it? So we hear that voice. Who will unlock? Who will unseal the scroll? Out comes a little lamb. And more to it, a little lamb who's been slain. It says the lamb standing as though slain.
How does one stand as though slain? Do lambs typically stand after they've been slain?
In other words, a figure of utter weakness and mildness, meekness, is the one who alone can open the seals. The point now is very clear, but it's very important. The only standpoint from which we should read the whole of the Bible is the standpoint of Christ crucified. The lamb standing as though slain, of course, is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world precisely through his suffering on the cross.
If Jesus could do that, why didn't God send him to be crucified thousands of years prior so there needn't be all the mass unaliving that he's portrayed as doing in the Old Testament? If Jesus had appeared and died for our sins immediately after Adam and Eve were kicked out of Eden, then there wouldn't be this big contrast between the Old Testament and New Testament God, because the most important events of the New Testament would have happened before all of the nasty business with the Amalekites and the Canaanites.
Now here's the point, Origen's point, very important. If, therefore, we read the Bible in such a way that we see God as capricious and cruel, or that encourages us to be violent, we are ipso facto misreading it. I want to say that again, because I think it's a very important point in the 2nd century and today. If you read the Bible in such a way that it leads you to say, hey, violence is a good thing, I should be more violent, or that God is hateful and violent, you have ipso facto misread it, because you've not read it from the standpoint of the Lamb standing as though slain. Okay, once that moves in place, it's a very important one, we still have the problem in some ways. Well, how do you read these famously difficult passages where God does seem to be pretty violent and cruel?
My issue with these passages is not that I think God is instructing us to be cruel, but rather that this supposedly all-loving God is being cruel. I'm not concerned about what it teaches us to do, but rather what it teaches us that God did.
Well, Origen said, read these passages in a metaphorical, allegorical, and symbolic way.
Why? Did they not actually happen? I'm sure most, if not all of them, were fictional because there's not much evidence that the Amalekites ever actually existed. However, does this guy believe that they were merely allegories rather than historical accounts?
As about the spiritual struggle, Israel stands for all that's in accord with God's purposes, for love and for forgiveness and compassion. And therefore, the enemies of Israel up and down the centuries, from the Amalekites to the Philistines, to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, to the Greeks, to the Romans, are not just about those ancient people. It stands for all the things that stand to thwart God's purposes. How should we fight them? The point is, we should fight them all the way down. Fight them all the way and not by half measures.
Unaliving the innocent kids goes well beyond fighting evil all the way down, doesn't it? If this is a metaphor for how you should deal with evil, it goes far beyond telling people not to take half measures. It seems to teach that when eliminating evil, you should also eliminate innocent bystanders, children, and even any animals that happen to be in the vicinity. And how do you square the idea that you shouldn't deal with evil with half measures with Jesus' instruction to resist not evil? How do we both fight evil all the way down while at the same time abstaining from resisting it? Why did Jesus say that the only reason Moses allowed divorce was because your hearts were hard and he had to accommodate that? That sounds like a half measure to me. And why do current apologists cite this passage as a reason why God permitted slavery? If that's the reason God allowed slavery, that sounds like a half measure to me too.
With that in mind, go back to one of the most notorious of the difficult passages, and that is God's command to Saul to put the ban on the Amalekites. So the same people, by the way, that Moses was fighting. Put the ban on them. Kill every man, woman, child, animal, right? And Saul doesn't do that. He kills most of them. He defeats them, but then keeps a lot of the livestock for himself, and he keeps King Agag, the king of the Amalekites, for himself. Maybe to hold him for ransom or who knows what, but he didn't kill him. Samuel the prophet comes in, he upbraids Saul, and then he takes out his sword, and it says he hacked Agag to pieces. Now again, you say, how in the world is this in the Bible, and how in the world is this describing the true God?
You're leaving out the part when God says that he regrets ever having made Saul king because he didn't follow instructions. Why would an omniscient God, who would have known that Saul would do this, make Saul king in the first place if he knew he would end up regretting it? Also, this passage is at odds with the apologists who insist that when God says to unalive everybody, he's just using hyperbole. If he were just using hyperbole and didn't mean it literally, why would God be upset at the fact that Saul didn't literally carry it out?
Think for a second. What do most of us sinners do with evil? We play around with it. We toy with it. We battle it to some degree, but then we typically keep a little bit for ourselves, right? We don't battle it all the way down. We play with it. We toy with it. That's the sin of Saul.
But again, Saul's supposed sin wasn't just that he didn't unalive all the guilty people, it was that he left some of the innocent animals alive as well. If there's an allegorical message here, it's not just that you're not adequately dealing with evil if you don't eliminate all of it. It seems to be that you're not adequately dealing with evil if you don't punish the innocent for it as well.
Here's a couple metaphors here. Suppose I went to Cardinal George and I said, Your Eminence, I'm so happy being a celibate priest that I'm celibate, 90% of the time. How happy would he be? Or if a husband went to his wife and said, honey, I love you, my marriage, it means so much to me. That's why I'm faithful to you, 75% of the time. I doubt she'd be real thrilled about that. Or if you said, yeah, child abuse, that's a real serious problem in this diocese, which is why, we got it about 65% under control.
It looks to me like that has historically been the church's attitude. Also, this is the kind of argument people make for slavery in the Bible. Yes, God always saw slavery as wrong. That's why he never forbid it anywhere in the Bible, but instead just left subtle clues that he didn't like it for Christians to figure out thousands of years later.
No, some forms of evil are so profound, they have to be hacked to pieces. We have to put the ban on them. See, now, read these texts not as a cruel, capricious, tyrannical, God.
When he's ordering any adjacent innocents to be eliminated as well, how could I think of that as anything less than capricious?
But rather as allegories of the spiritual struggle and the way that we should fight evil all the way down. Here's another perspective, also from Origen, but picked up by a lot of people over the centuries. We're obsessed with historicity in a way that the ancient peoples weren't. That's to say, with the very literalistic reading of text. These ancient peoples were very comfortable with more symbolic ways of reading text.
In other words, they treat a lot of the stuff in the Bible like it didn't really happen.
You're an ancient Israelite, so you're a warlike people, as many of them were. They're fighting all the time against their enemies. And you're writing in a poetic way. You're trying to express the truth of God through a poetic allusion. What are you going to reach for? You're a warlike people. Well, you might reach for this militaristic metaphor. Yahweh fights for his people. Yahweh fights the enemies of Israel. Well, how's he going to fight them? If you're trying to describe God, right? God who's all-powerful, all-sovereign, what are you going to say? Are you going to say, yeah, and he killed half of Israel's enemies. That's the God we believe in.
If we are to perceive this God as also being infinitely loving and merciful, then shouldn't he be portrayed as, showing mercy? He should certainly be portrayed as showing mercy to the innocent, but if this God is exceptionally merciful, then he should show some mercy to the guilty as well, should he not? Otherwise, what reason do we have to believe that he is superhumanly merciful?
Yeah, he's great. God killed a third of the Philistines. No.
Apparently, you're not portraying this omnibenevolent, merciful, infinitely loving God as sufficiently great if you write a story in which he only unalives a third of an entire ethnic group. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.